Late one stormy night, a kind-hearted woman opened her creaky barn to a dusty traveler, a man too weary to stand, yet with eyes that held untold stories. She gave him shelter, a blanket, and hope, never imagining who he truly was. Because at sunrise, the same traveler would return not in rags, but in a grand carriage overflowing with gold, ready to repay her kindness in a way she could never dream. It moved across the prairie like a living thing, low and hungry, pulling the dust from the earth and turning the sky the color of old iron. Clara Gable stood at the window of her cabin, one hand pressed against the glass, watching the horizon disappear. The storm rolled toward her land with the weight of something inevitable, swallowing fences and trees, and the last thread of daylight, until there was nothing left but the howl of it, pressing against the walls like 1,000 voices screaming all at once. She'd seen storms before. This land had taught her to read the sky the way some people read scripture, with fear and respect and the quiet knowledge that you were small beneath it. But this one felt different. Heavier, as if the wind carried more than dust. The barn door rattled hard against its frame. Clara turned, her breath catching. The sound came again. Louder this time, deliberate. Not the wind, something else. Her husband's rifle leaned against the wall near the door, where it had stood for 3 winters since they'd buried him. She hadn't fired it since. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, the wood cold and unfamiliar against her palms. The lantern flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the floor, and for a moment she stood frozen between the light and the door, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out the storm. Another sound. A thud, then silence. She crossed the room slowly, the rifle heavy in her grip, and pressed her ear against the door. The wind screamed outside, but beneath it, faint, almost lost, she heard something else. A breath, ragged, human. Her hand hovered over the latch. Turn away, a voice inside her whispered. Lock the door, wait for morning. But morning felt impossibly far, and the sound on the other side of that door was the sound of something dying. She opened it. The storm hit her like a fist, tearing the breath from her lungs and filling her mouth with dust. She staggered back, squinting into the wall of wind and dirt, and saw him. A shape collapsed against the barn, barely visible through the chaos. A man, or what was left of one. He was covered in dust so thick it looked like ash, his clothes torn and dark with something that might have been blood or mud or both. His face was turned toward the ground, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something he'd already lost. He wasn't moving. Clara's grip tightened on the rifle. Leave him, the voice said again. You don't know who he is, what he's done. But she was already stepping forward, the wind pulling at her skirt, her boots sinking into the loose dirt. She crouched beside him, close enough to see the rise and fall of his chest. Shallow, uneven, barely there. His hair was matted with dust and sweat, his hands blistered and raw. He looked like he'd crawled through hell just to collapse at her door. "Can you hear me?" she called over the wind. No answer. She set the rifle down and slipped her hands beneath his arms, her body straining as she dragged him toward the barn. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight and bone, and by the time she'd hauled him inside and dropped him onto the hay, her lungs were burning and her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the lantern. The barn was quieter, but the storm still rattled the walls, pushing through the cracks like something trying to get in. Clara knelt beside the stranger, her breath coming fast, and lifted the lantern to see his face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30. His jaw was sharp beneath the dust, his skin pale where the dirt hadn't settled. There was a cut above his left eye, still bleeding, and his lips were cracked and dry. He looked like a man who'd been running for a long time. She sat back on her heels, staring at him, her mind racing. "Who are you?" The wind answered with a scream. Clara rose slowly and moved to the barn door, pulling it shut against the storm. The latch clicked into place and the noise dropped to a dull roar. She stood there for a moment, her forehead resting against the wood, her heart still pounding. She'd made a choice. She didn't know if it was the right one. When she turned back, the stranger's eyes were open, just barely. Dark eyes clouded with pain and exhaustion, fixed on her with the intensity of someone trying to remember where they were. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched her, his chest rising and falling with effort. Clara took a step forward, then stopped. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. He blinked, slow, as if the words took time to reach him. Then his eyes closed again, and his head fell to the side. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. For a long time, she just stood there, listening to the storm. The scent of rain and blood and dust filled the air, heavy and strange, and somewhere beyond the walls, thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. The lantern light flickered against the hay, casting the stranger's face in shadow. Clara moved to the corner of the barn where she kept an old wooden crate of supplies, rags, a bottle of whiskey her husband had saved for winter, a tin of salve she'd made from beeswax and herbs. She brought them back and knelt beside the stranger again, wetting a rag with water from the bucket near the door. She hesitated, then pressed the cloth to the cut above his eye. He flinched, his hand jerking toward her wrist, but he didn't grab her. Just held his hand there, hovering, as if he wasn't sure whether to push her away or let her help. His fingers were calloused, scarred, trembling. "Easy," she whispered. His hand dropped. She cleaned the wound slowly, carefully, wiping away the blood and dirt until she could see the ragged edges of the cut. It wasn't deep, but it would scar. She dabbed salve onto it, then wrapped a strip of cloth around his head to hold it in place. His breathing evened out as she worked, his body going slack against the hay. When she finished, she sat back and looked at him. He was asleep now, or unconscious. She wasn't sure which. The storm outside had begun to ease, the wind dropping to a steady moan, the rain tapping against the roof in a rhythm that almost sounded gentle. Clara pulled a worn blanket from the crate and draped it over the stranger, tucking it around his shoulders the way she used to for her husband on cold nights. Then she picked up the rifle and moved to the far side of the barn, where she could watch the door and the stranger both. She didn't sleep. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the sound of rain and the faint crackle of the dying fire in the cabin beyond. Clara watched the stranger's chest rise and fall, her mind circling the same questions over and over. "Who are you? What were you running from? Why did you come here?" And beneath those questions, quieter but sharper, "What have I brought into my home?" The lantern burned low, the flame guttering in the glass, and the darkness pressed closer. Clara's eyes grew heavy, her body aching from the cold and the fear and the exhaustion of holding herself upright. But she didn't move, didn't lower the rifle. She'd learned a long time ago that mercy didn't always mean safety. When dawn finally came, it came slowly, the light creeping through the cracks in the barn walls like something uncertain. The storm had passed, leaving the land soaked and silent, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and broken things. Clara stood and stretched, her muscles stiff, and walked to the door. She pushed it open and stepped outside. The world had changed overnight. The fields were littered with debris branches, shingles torn from the roof, a wagon wheel half buried in mud. The fence along the eastern pasture had collapsed, the posts snapped like matchsticks, and beyond it all, the horizon stretched wide and empty, the sky pale and bruised. She stood there for a long moment, taking it in, then turned back toward the barn. The stranger was awake. He was sitting up now, his back against the wall, the blanket pooled around his waist. His eyes were clearer than they'd been the night before, but there was something guarded in them, something that didn't quite meet her gaze. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, low, like gravel scraping wood. Clara didn't answer right away. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the rifle still in her hand. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked down at his hands, his jaw tightening. "Nobody," he said, "just a traveler. Nobody doesn't show up half dead in a storm like that." He didn't argue, just sat there, silent, his fingers curling into fists against his knees. Clara waited. "My name's Illy," he said finally, "Illy Mercer." Where are you from? East. He gestured vaguely toward the door, a long way east. And where are you going? He looked up at her then, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't just exhaustion. It was fear. Away, he said quietly. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Clara set the rifle against the wall, though she kept it within reach. You can stay until you're strong enough to leave, she said. But I want the truth. Not now, but soon. Illy nodded, something like relief flickering across his face. Thank you, he said again. She turned toward the door, then stopped. There's water in the bucket. Bread in the cabin if you can walk. Don't make me regret this. He didn't answer. Clara stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her, and stood in the pale morning light. The wind had died completely now, leaving only the soft drip of water from the eaves and the distant call of a crow somewhere beyond the ridge. She looked toward the horizon, where the storm had disappeared, and wondered what it had left behind. Inside the barn, Illy Mercer sat alone in the hay, his head bowed, his hands trembling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished coin. Gold, worn smooth by years of handling, with a name etched faintly along the edge. Redemption Creek Mining Company. He stared at it for a long time, then closed his fist around it and pressed it against his chest. Outside, the sky grew brighter, but the shadows in the barn remained. The morning stretched long and silent across the valley, the kind of silence that followed storms, thick with waiting, as if the earth itself was listening for what would come next. Clara stood at the edge of her porch, a tin cup of coffee cooling in her hands, watching the barn door. It hadn't opened since dawn. No movement. No sound except the slow drip of water from the roof, and the occasional creak of settling wood. She'd barely slept. Every time her eyes had closed, she'd seen his face. That moment when he'd looked at her with fear so raw it felt like touching an open wound. Away, he'd said, running from something. Or someone. The smart thing would be to send him on his way. Give him a meal, maybe some supplies, and let him disappear back into whatever trouble he'd crawled out of. This was her land, her life. She'd fought too hard to keep it after Samuel died to let some stranger's problems become her own. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see a stranger. She saw a man who'd collapsed at her door in the worst storm she'd witnessed in 5 years, covered in blood and dust, with hands that looked like they'd been clawing through hell itself. She saw someone who'd had nowhere else to go. Clara drained the last of her coffee, bitter and cold, and walked toward the barn. Inside, Illy was awake. He sat on an overturned crate near the back wall, his shoulders hunched, his hands resting on his knees. The bandage she'd wrapped around his head was still in place, though it had darkened with dried blood. He looked up when she entered, his eyes tracking her movement with the wariness of an animal that had learned not to trust shelter. You didn't eat, Clara said, nodding toward the untouched bread she'd left on the hay bale near the door. Wasn't sure I was supposed to, Illy said quietly. I told you there was bread. You also told me not to make you regret this. He glanced toward the rifle leaning against the wall near her. Figured taking anything without asking might be a bad start. Clara studied him for a moment, then picked up the bread and held it out. You're no good to anyone if you starve. He took it slowly, his fingers brushing hers for just a second before he pulled back. His hands were worse in the daylight, blistered and raw, the skin peeling in places, nails cracked and blackened. He held the bread carefully, as if even that small weight hurt. When's the last time you ate? She asked. 2 days, maybe 3. He broke off a piece and chewed slowly, his jaw working with effort. Lost track somewhere around the second night. Second night of what? Illy stopped chewing. His eyes dropped to the bread in his hands. Running, he said finally. Clara pulled over another crate and sat down across from him, far enough to keep distance, close enough to see his face clearly. From the law, no. Then from who, he didn't answer. Just took another bite, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, toward the barn door and the light spilling through the cracks. Clara waited. She'd learned patience from this land, from the slow turn of seasons and the stubborn resilience of things that refused to die even when the world tried to kill them. Silence didn't scare her, and she had a feeling it scared him more than questions. Finally, Illy spoke. "Men with money," he said quietly. "Men who don't like losing it. You steal from them." His head snapped up, his eyes sharp. "No." "Then what?" I told them the truth. His voice was harder now, edged with something bitter. "That's worse than stealing." Clara frowned. "What truth?" Illy set the bread down on his knee, his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, she thought he might stand up and walk out, disappear back into whatever shadows he'd come from. But he stayed. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and raw. "I worked for them. The Redemption Creek Mining Company. Spent 2 years in those tunnels, breaking my back for pennies, while they got rich off the gold we pulled from the earth." He paused, swallowing hard. "My brother worked there too. Younger than me, 17. He had a cough. Bad one, from the dust. Couldn't shake it. I asked the foreman for a day off so I could take him to a doctor in town. And they said no. Said if he didn't work, he didn't eat. So he went back down." Illy's hands curled into fists. "The tunnel collapsed that afternoon, killed 6 men. My brother was one of them." The air in the barn seemed to grow heavier, pressing down like the weight of earth and stone. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. Illy shook his head. "They didn't even stop the operation. Just cleared the bodies and sent the rest of us back down the next day. Like it didn't matter. Like he didn't matter." He looked up at her, his eyes bright with something that wasn't quite tears but close. "So I started asking questions. How much gold were we pulling? Where was the money going? Why weren't we getting paid what we were promised? And they didn't like that. They didn't like that." Illy repeated. "Told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd end up like my brother. So I kept digging, not for gold, for records, ledgers, proof that they were stealing from us, from the families of the men who died. When I found it, I took it." Clara's breath caught. "You took their records, and the gold they owed us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin she'd glimpsed the night before, tarnished, heavy, with the company name etched faintly along the edge. "This was my brother's share, the only thing they ever gave his widow, 1 coin, for 2 years of his life." He held it out toward the light, and for a moment it gleamed like a shard of the sun. "They want it back," Illy said quietly. "All of it, and they want me dead for taking it." Clara sat back, her mind turning over his words. She looked at him, really looked, and saw past the dust and the exhaustion to the man underneath. He wasn't a thief. He was someone who'd lost everything, and decided that losing one more thing didn't matter if it meant doing what was right. She understood that. She'd felt it herself, standing over Samuel's grave 3 winters ago, when the bank had come to take the farm and she'd told them they'd have to shoot her first. "Where's the rest of it?" she asked. "Hidden out in the hills about a day's ride north." He slipped the coin back into his pocket. "I was trying to get it somewhere safe, somewhere I could get it to the families who deserved it. But they sent men after me, tracked me for weeks. I kept moving, kept running." He looked down at his hands, then the storm hit, and I saw your light. Clara exhaled slowly, the pieces falling into place. "So they'll come here, maybe, probably." Illy met her eyes, and there was no deception in them. Just exhaustion and something that looked like regret. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door. If I'd had anywhere else to go, I would have. But you didn't. No." She stood, brushing the dust from her skirt, and walked to the barn door. Outside, the day had warmed, the sun breaking through the clouds in pale shafts that turned the wet earth to gold. Her land stretched out before her, scarred by the storm, but still standing, still hers. "You can stay," she said without turning around, "until you're strong enough to ride, but you'll work. I need that fence mended, the roof patched, and the well cleared. If you're going to be here, you'll earn your keep." "Yes, ma'am." "And if they come, these men of yours, you tell me no lies, no surprises." "I will." Clara glanced back at him over her shoulder. "You give me your word on that?" Illy stood slowly, his body stiff and aching, and nodded. "You have it." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching for cracks for doubt. But all she saw was a man who'd already lost too much to lie about what little he had left. "Good," she said. "There's tools in the shed. Start with the fence." She walked out, leaving him alone in the barn, and didn't look back. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Slow, careful, like two people learning to walk on ice. Illy worked from dawn until dusk, his hands blistered and bleeding but steady. He didn't complain, didn't ask for more than what she offered. He fixed the fence posts one by one, hauling new timber from the grove near the creek, digging holes in the soft earth with a focus that looked like penance. Clara watched him from the porch sometimes, her hands busy with mending or shelling beans, but her eyes tracking his movements. He worked like a man trying to outrun ghosts. Every swing of the hammer, every nail driven home. It was as if he was building something more than a fence. As if he was trying to prove he was still worth something. She brought him water at midday, setting the bucket down without a word. He'd nod, drink, then go back to work. No conversation, just the sound of metal on wood and the wind moving through the grass. At night, he slept in the barn. She could see the faint glow of the lantern through the cracks until late, sometimes past midnight. She wondered if he slept at all, or if the memories kept him awake the way hers did, replaying moments he couldn't change, conversations with people who were gone. On the fourth day, Clara found him standing by the well, staring down into the dark water with an expression she couldn't read. "Something wrong with it?" she asked. Illy looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten where he was. "No, just thinking about." He hesitated, then gestured toward the water. "My brother used to say you could see the future in still water if you looked long enough. Said the trick was knowing whether you were seeing what would happen or what could happen." He smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. "I never figured out the difference." Clara stepped closer, looking down into the well. The water was dark and clear, reflecting the sky above. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe. They stood there in silence, the wind pulling at their clothes. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Clara felt something shift between them. Not trust, not yet. But the beginning of it, like the first thaw after a long winter, when the ice started to crack and you could hear the water moving underneath. "You miss him," she said quietly, "every day." "I know what that's like." Illy glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Your husband," she nodded. 3 years this winter. Heart gave out while he was chopping wood. Found him in the snow." She swallowed, the memory sharp as broken glass. "I kept thinking if I'd just been there. If I'd gone with him instead of staying inside, maybe I could have." "You can't think like that," Illy said gently. "It'll eat you alive. I know." Clara looked up at the sky, blinking against the brightness. "Doesn't stop me from trying." He didn't answer. Just stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool air. And together, they watched the clouds drift past like ships on an invisible sea. That night, Clara made stew. Venison and potatoes and carrots from the cellar, thick and rich with the smell of rosemary and salt. She filled 2 bowls and carried one out to the barn, knocking softly before pushing the door open. Illy was sitting on the crate again, a piece of leather in his hands, stitching a tear in his boot. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Thought you might be hungry," Clara said, holding out the bowl. "I am. Thank you." She handed it to him, then hesitated. "You can eat in the cabin if you want. It's warmer." Illy glanced toward the door, then shook his head. "I don't want to intrude. You're already here. Might as well be comfortable." He studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she meant it. Then he stood, wincing slightly as his back straightened, and followed her across the yard. Inside, the cabin was small but warm, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting golden light across the worn furniture, and the faded quilt draped over the chair. Clara gestured toward the table, and Illy sat, setting his bowl down carefully. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin and the soft hiss of the fire. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It felt ordinary, like something they'd done 100 times before. When they finished, Illy helped her clear the table, carrying the bowls to the basin near the door. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he was afraid of breaking something. "You don't have to do that," Clara said. "I know, but he did it anyway." As he turned to leave, Clara spoke. "Illy," he stopped, looking back at her. "Thank you," she said, "for the work, for being honest." He nodded slowly. "Thank you for not turning me away." The door closed softly behind him, and Clara stood alone in the firelight, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Outside, the night was quiet, the stars bright and cold, and somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the faint sound of the barn door closing. She looked down at the table, at the two bowls sitting side by side, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but close. The coin sat on the barn floor where it had slipped from Illy's pocket, gleaming faintly in the lantern light. He picked it up slowly, his fingers closing around it, and pressed it against his chest. Redemption, the name read. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he could almost hear his brother's voice. Young, bright, full of dreams that had died in the earth. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, soft and low, carrying secrets only the night would keep. The sky opened wider as the days passed, stretching blue and endless over the valley like a promise the world had forgotten how to keep. The mud dried into dust, the broken branches were cleared, and slowly, so slowly it almost felt like imagining, the land began to remember what it had been before the storm. Illy worked. He worked until his hands bled, until his shoulders burned, and his back ached with the kind of pain that settles deep into the bone. He replaced the fence posts along the eastern pasture, restrung the wire with fingers that fumbled and slipped, and rebuilt the gate that had been torn from its hinges. He patched the holes in the barn roof with whatever scraps of wood and tin he could find, climbing up in the early morning when the air was still cool, and the sun hadn't yet turned the metal too hot to touch. Clara watched him from a distance at first, the way she might watch a stray dog she'd fed once, waiting to see if it would stay or run. But as the days turned into a week, then two, her distance shortened. She brought him water more often, left bread and cheese wrapped in cloth near the shed, started asking questions that weren't about survival, but about the work itself. "That corner post is leaning," she said one afternoon, standing at the edge of the pasture with her arms crossed. Storm loosened the base. Illy looked up from where he was kneeling, dirt streaked across his face, and followed her gaze. She was right. The post tilted slightly to the west, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "I'll fix it tomorrow," he said. "Fix it right." Samuel always said a fence is only as strong as its weakest post. "Samuel was your husband," Clara nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "He built most of this. The barn, the fence, the well house. Took him years, but he didn't cut corners." She glanced at Illy. "Don't you cut them either?" "No, ma'am." She almost smiled, almost. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, her skirt swaying with each step, and Illy watched her go with something tight in his chest. Something that felt like gratitude and guilt braided together so close he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He fixed the post the next morning, digging down to the base and resetting it with stone and packed earth until it stood straight and true. When Clara came out to check, she ran her hand along the wood, testing its strength, then nodded once. "Good," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and Illy felt the words settle over him like sunlight breaking through clouds. The rhythm of the days became familiar, almost comfortable. Illy rose before dawn, when the world was still gray and quiet, and worked until the light began to fade. Clara tended the garden, fed the chickens, hauled water from the well. They moved around each other like two people learning the steps of a dance neither had chosen, but both were trying not to ruin. At meals, they sat across from each other at the small wooden table, the silence between them no longer heavy, but soft, like the space between breaths. Clara made simple food, cornbread and beans, fried eggs and salt pork, stew that simmered all afternoon and filled the cabin with warmth. Illy ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite was something he didn't quite deserve. "You don't have to be so quiet," Clara said one evening, setting a plate of bread in front of him. Illy looked up, startled. "I didn't realize I was." "You are. Like you're afraid to take up space." He glanced down at his hands folded on the table. "I guess I'm just not used to this." "To what?" "Sitting at a table with someone who doesn't hate me." The words came out soft, almost without weight, but Clara felt them land heavy in her chest. She sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup of coffee, and studied his face. The cut above his eye had healed into a thin scar, pale against his tanned skin. The hollows beneath his cheekbones had filled in slightly, the sharpness of hunger giving way to something steadier. "I don't hate you," she said quietly. "You don't know me. I know enough." Illy met her eyes, and for a moment, something passed between them, fragile and uncertain, like the first shoots of green pushing through hard ground. "Thank you," he said. Clara nodded and looked away, out the window where the light was fading into purple and gold. "Eat your supper." He did, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, it didn't taste like ash. On Sunday, Clara went to town. She didn't ask Illy to come, and he didn't offer. She hitched the wagon herself, her movements quick and practiced, and climbed onto the bench with her coat pulled tight against the morning chill. Illy stood near the barn, watching her go, and when she glanced back, she saw him standing there still, silent, like a man waiting for the world to decide what to do with him. "I'll be back before dark," she called. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, and then she was gone. The wagon rattling down the rutted road toward the cluster of buildings that made up Pine Ridge. The town was small, barely more than a main street lined with a general store, a church, a saloon, and a scattering of houses that leaned against each other like tired old men. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the store and climbed down, nodding to the few people who passed. Most nodded back, some didn't. She'd lived here all her life, but after Samuel died, the town had started to feel different, smaller, colder. People still spoke to her, still sold her flour and nails and lamp oil. But there was a distance now, a careful politeness that reminded her she was a widow, alone, and therefore either pitied or suspected. Inside the store, the air smelled like coffee and sawdust. Clara moved through the aisles, gathering what she needed: salt, sugar, a bag of cornmeal, thread. She was reaching for a tin of baking powder when a voice spoke behind her. "Clara Gable, haven't seen you in a while." She turned. Martin Hayes stood near the counter, his hat in his hands, his smile polite but edged with something sharper. He owned the land to the south of hers, twice as much, worked by hired hands, and he'd made it clear more than once that he'd be happy to buy her out if she ever decided farming was too much for a woman alone. "Been busy," Clara said evenly. "I heard you had some damage from the storm. Fence down, roof torn up. It's fixed." "You fix it yourself." Clara set the baking powder in her basket, most of it. Martin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Must have been a lot of work for one person." "I manage." "I'm sure you do." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But if you ever need help, real help, you know where to find me." Clara met his gaze, her jaw tight. "I appreciate the offer, Martin, but I'm fine." "Are you?" He glanced toward the window where her wagon sat empty in the street. "Word is you've got someone staying out at your place, stranger. Showed up around the time of the storm." The air in the store seemed to still. "Who told you that?" Clara asked quietly. "People talk. You know how it is." Martin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thought I'd mention it. Times being what they are, you can't be too careful. Man shows up out of nowhere. No one knows where he's from. Could be trouble." "He's not trouble." "You sure about that?" Clara picked up her basket and stepped past him, her voice low and steady. "I'm sure." She paid for her goods and left without looking back, but she could feel Martin's eyes on her all the way to the wagon. As she climbed onto the bench, she saw Mrs. Lawson from the church standing across the street, whispering to another woman. Both of them glanced at Clara, then quickly looked away. The ride home felt longer than it should have. Illy was splitting wood when she returned, his shirt damp with sweat, his movements steady and rhythmic. He looked up when he heard the wagon and set the axe down, wiping his hands on his pants. "Everything all right?" he asked. Clara climbed down and started unloading the supplies, her movements stiff. "Fine." "You don't look fine." She stopped, a bag of cornmeal in her hands, and turned to face him. "People in town are talking about you." Illy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something dark and resigned. "What are they saying? That you're trouble? That I shouldn't trust you?" She set the bag down harder than she meant to. "That I'm foolish for letting you stay. Maybe they're right. They're not. You don't know that." Clara stepped closer, her voice sharp. "I know you've spent 2 weeks fixing my land. I know you work harder than any hired hand I've ever seen. And I know you haven't given me a single reason not to trust you." She paused, her chest tight. "So unless you're planning to prove them right, I don't want to hear it." Illy stared at her, something raw and unguarded crossing his face. "I'm not planning anything except finishing what I started." "Good." They stood there in the fading light, the space between them charged with something neither of them could name. Then Clara picked up the cornmeal again and carried it inside, leaving Illy standing alone by the woodpile. He watched her go, then turned back to the axe, lifting it high and bringing it down hard. The wood split clean, the sound echoing across the empty valley. That night, they ate together again, cornbread and honey, beans seasoned with bacon. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls, and outside, the wind moved soft through the grass. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said quietly. Illy looked up from his plate. "Of course. Do you regret it, taking the gold?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. "No," he said finally. "I regret that it mattered, that it was the only way to make them listen." He set his fork down. "But I don't regret trying to do right by the people they hurt." Clara nodded slowly. "Even if it cost you everything, especially then." She looked at him, really looked, and saw past the exhaustion and the scars to the man underneath. A man who'd lost his brother, his home, his future, and still believed some things were worth fighting for. "Samuel used to say that too," she said softly, "that doing right doesn't always feel good, but it's still right. He sounds like he was a good man." He was. Clara's voice caught slightly, and she looked down at her hands. "I miss him, every day, I know." They finished eating in silence, and when Illy stood to leave, Clara spoke again. "You don't have to sleep in the barn anymore. There's a room, small off the kitchen. Samuel used it for storage, but it's got a bed, a real one." Illy froze, his hand on the door. "I don't want to. It's warmer, and you've earned it." He turned, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded slowly, something like relief softening the lines of his face. "Thank you, Clara." It was the first time he'd said her name, and hearing it felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. "You're welcome, Illy." Spring crept closer. The nights grew shorter, the mornings warmer. Wildflowers began to bloom along the edges of the pasture, tiny bursts of yellow and white that Clara hadn't seen in years. Illy noticed them one morning and picked a handful, setting them in a jar on the kitchen table without a word. Clara found them when she came inside, their petals bright against the worn wood, and something in her chest cracked open just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. She didn't say anything, just touched the edge of the jar with her fingertips and smiled. Outside, the world stretched wide and golden, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel lonely. But in the distance, beyond the ridge where the road disappeared into shadow, dust rose against the horizon. Faint, barely visible, like the first warning of a storm, still too far away to name. Clara saw it first, a thin line rising against the pale morning sky, moving slow and deliberate along the ridge road. She stood at the well with a bucket in her hands, the water inside it gone still as glass, and watched the dust grow thicker. 3 shapes took form against the light, riders, moving toward her land with the kind of patience that had nothing to do with kindness. Her chest tightened. "Illy," she called, her voice low but sharp. He appeared from around the barn, a hammer still in his hand, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked at her first, then followed her gaze to the ridge. His entire body went rigid. "How many?" he asked. "3. He set the hammer down slowly, his jaw clenching. "They found me." Clara's grip tightened on the bucket handle. "You sure it's them?" "I'm sure." She could hear it in his voice, the certainty, the resignation, the fear he was trying to bury beneath steady breathing. She looked at him, then back at the riders. They were closer now, close enough that she could make out the dark shapes of their horses, the wide brims of their hats. "Get inside," she said. "Clara, inside, now." Illy hesitated, something flickering across his face. Protest, maybe, or shame. But he didn't argue. He turned and walked toward the cabin, his movements stiff, controlled, like a man trying not to run. Clara watched him disappear through the door, then set the bucket down and wiped her hands on her apron. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she kept her face calm, her shoulders straight. She'd faced men before, men who thought a widow alone was easy to intimidate. She'd learned how to stand her ground. By the time the riders reached her gate, Clara was standing on the porch, her hands folded in front of her, Samuel's rifle leaning just inside the doorframe where she could reach it in 2 steps. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop and tipped his hat. He was older than the other 2, maybe 50, with a face weathered by sun and wind and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His coat was dark, expensive, the kind that didn't belong on a working ranch. Behind him, the other 2 men sat silent and watchful, their hands resting too close to the guns at their hips. "Ma'am," the lead rider said, his voice smooth as oil. "Name's Garrett, Thomas Garrett. I apologize for the intrusion, but we're looking for someone, and we were hoping you might be able to help us." Clara didn't move. "Looking for who?" "A man. Goes by the name Illy Mercer." Garrett leaned forward slightly in his saddle, his eyes scanning the yard. The barn, the shed, the fence line. About 30 years old, dark hair, probably traveling alone. "He stole something from the company I represent, and we've been tracking him for some time." "What company would that be?" "Redemption Creek Mining. Perhaps you've heard of it." "Can't say I have." Garrett's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "It's a fair distance east of here. We've been following Mercer's trail for weeks now. Last we heard, he was headed this direction. Storm hit around the same time, made tracking difficult, but—" He gestured toward the freshly repaired fence, the patched roof. "Looks like you had some work done recently. That you're doing, ma'am, or did you have help?" Clara's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice even. "I manage my own land, Mr. Garrett." "I'm sure you do, but a storm like that takes a toll. Must have been a lot of work for one person." "I'm stronger than I look." One of the men behind Garrett, a younger one with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, let out a low chuckle. Garrett silenced him with a glance, then turned back to Clara. "I don't doubt that, ma'am, but the truth is, we have reason to believe Mercer came through here. And if he did, you'd be doing yourself a favor by telling us. Man's dangerous, thief, liar, the kind who takes advantage of good people's kindness." He paused, letting the words settle. "We just want to bring him back to face justice, nothing more." "Justice?" Clara repeated, her voice flat. "That's right. And if I had seen this man, what would your justice look like?" Garrett's smile faded slightly. "That's not your concern, ma'am. All you need to know is that helping him would be a mistake, a serious one." The air between them felt brittle, like glass about to crack. Clara looked at the 3 men, at their guns, their horses, their eyes that had already decided she was either an obstacle or a tool. She thought of Illy inside the cabin, listening to every word. She thought of his brother, buried in a collapsed mine. She thought of the gold coin pressed into a widow's hand, payment for a life. And she thought of Samuel, who'd always said that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when the world was watching, but what they did when no one would ever know. "I haven't seen anyone," Clara said clearly. "Storm came through, tore up my land, and I've been fixing it myself. If this man you're looking for passed through, he didn't stop here." Garrett studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and calculating. Then he straightened in his saddle. You're sure about that? I'm sure. Because if we find out you're lying, if we find out you've been hiding him, there will be consequences, for you and your property. Clara's hands tightened into fists at her sides, but she didn't look away. Are you threatening me, Mr. Garrett? I'm informing you, ma'am. That's all. He tipped his hat again, the gesture slow and deliberate. We'll be around for a while, asking questions in town, keeping an eye out. If you happen to remember anything at all, you let the sheriff know. He'll pass the message along. I'll keep that in mind. Garrett turned his horse, and the other two followed. They rode back down the road slowly, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. Clara watched them until they disappeared over the ridge, the dust trailing behind them like smoke. Then she turned and walked inside. Billy was standing in the kitchen, his back pressed against the wall, his face pale. He'd heard everything. I'm sorry, he said, his voice hoarse. I'm so sorry, Clara. I never should have. Stop, Clara said sharply. She moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside, watching the empty road. They'll go to town, start asking questions. Someone will talk. Someone always does. Then I'll leave tonight. I'll take what I need and go, and they'll never know you helped me. They already know. Illy stared at her. What? They didn't come here by accident, Illy. They came because someone told them you were here, or at least that I had help after the storm. Clara turned to face him, her expression hard. Martin Hayes, he saw me in town last week, asked about you, started spreading talk. She exhaled slowly, her hands trembling despite her effort to keep them still. They know, or they suspect. Either way, you leaving now won't change that. Then what do we do? Clara looked at him. At the fear in his eyes, the guilt, the exhaustion of a man who'd been running so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still. And she made a choice. The same one she'd made the night the storm brought him to her door. We don't run, she said quietly. We stand our ground. Clara, these men, they're not just going to give up. They'll come back. And when they do, we'll deal with it. She stepped closer, her voice steady. You told me you took that gold because it was the right thing to do, because those families deserved it. Do you still believe that? Yes. Then we don't let them win. Illy's throat worked as he swallowed hard. You don't owe me this. No, Clara agreed. I don't, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because they came onto my land, threatened me, and expected me to hand you over like a scared dog. Her eyes flashed. I won't let men like that tell me what's right. For a long moment, they stood in the quiet kitchen, the light slanting through the windows, the world outside vast and indifferent. Then Illy nodded slowly. Thank you, he whispered. Clara turned away, her hands shaking now that the riders were gone, now that the adrenaline was fading and leaving only the cold weight of what she'd just done. Go check the barn, she said. Make sure there's nothing there that ties you to the company. No papers, no coins, nothing they can use. All right. And Illy, he stopped at the door, if they come back, if it comes to that, you let me do the talking. Understand, I understand. He slipped outside, and Clara sank into the chair by the table, her legs suddenly weak. She pressed her hands to her face, breathing slowly, trying to calm the wild hammering of her heart. She'd just lied to armed men. Put herself between a fugitive and the people hunting him. She didn't know if that made her brave or foolish, but it was done. There was no taking it back. Outside, the sun climbed higher and the valley stretched wide and golden. But the beauty felt hollow now, fragile, like something that could shatter with a single wrong word. By evening, the news had spread. Clara saw it in the faces of the people who rode past her gate without stopping, their eyes sliding away when she looked up from the garden. She saw it in the way Mrs. Lawson turned her back in the churchyard the following Sunday, whispering to the women beside her. She saw it in the silence that followed her through the general store, the careful distance people kept, as if trouble were something you could catch like sickness. Heard you had visitors, the clerk said when she came to pay, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. Men from Redemption Creek. They were looking for someone. Clara said evenly, find him, no. The clerk nodded slowly, counting her change with deliberate care. Strange, them coming all this way. Must be important, whatever he took. Clara picked up her basket. I wouldn't know. But the clerk's eyes followed her all the way to the door. At home, Illy worked with a kind of quiet desperation, as if keeping his hands busy could hold the world at bay. He reinforced the barn door, cleared brush from the fire line, split enough wood to last through the next winter twice over. Clara watched him push himself harder each day, saw the way his shoulders tensed whenever a bird took flight or a branch snapped in the wind. You can't work yourself to death, she said one afternoon, finding him bent over the plow, sweat soaking through his shirt. I can try. Illy, if I stop, I'll think. He straightened, wiping his face with his sleeve. And if I think, I'll realize what I've done to you. What I'm still doing. He looked at her, his eyes red, rimmed and raw. You should have turned me in. I should have done a lot of things. Clara, I chose this, she said firmly. Just like you chose to take that gold. We both made our choices. Now we live with them. Illy stared at her for a long moment, then nodded and went back to work. 3 days later, the riders returned. This time there were 4 of them. Garrett was in the lead again, but the men behind him looked harder, meaner, their eyes scanning the property like wolves circling prey. Clara met them at the gate, the rifle in her hands this time, not hidden. Mr. Garrett, she said coldly, didn't expect to see you again so soon. Ma'am. Garrett's smile was gone, replaced by something sharper. We've been talking to folks in town. Seems a few of them remember seeing a stranger around here after the storm. Man matching Mercer's description. People see what they want to see. Do they? Garrett dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. Because I'm starting to think you've been lying to us, Mrs. Gable, and that would be a shame for both of us. Clara raised the rifle slightly, not aiming, just making sure he saw it. I've told you everything I know. Now I'm asking you to leave my property. Can't do that, not until we've had a look around. You have no right. We have every right. Garrett took a step forward, his voice dropping. That man stole from us. That makes this a matter of law, and if you're harboring him, that makes you an accomplice. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. Get off my land. Or what? You'll shoot me. Garrett laughed, low and cold. You're one woman, Mrs. Gable, alone, and we're 4 men with a legal claim. You really want to make this harder than it needs to be. The air hung tight as a drawn bowstring. Then the cabin door opened. Illy stepped out onto the porch, his hands raised, his face set with the kind of calm that came from knowing there was no more running. He walked slowly down the steps and across the yard until he stood beside Clara, his eyes locked on Garrett. I'm Illy Mercer, he said quietly, and she didn't know. She found me half dead in the storm and took pity on me, that's all. Illy, don't, Clara started. It's all right. He glanced at her, something soft and sad in his expression. It's time. Garrett's smile returned, sharp and victorious. Well, that makes things easier. You leave her alone, Illy said, his voice harder now. She had nothing to do with what I took. You want me, fine. But you leave her out of it. That's not how this works, Mercer. Then let me make you a deal. Illy lowered his hands slowly. I'll tell you where the gold is. All of it. You get what you came for and you leave her alone. She keeps her land, her life, no consequences. Garrett tilted his head, considering, and why would I trust you? Because I'm tired of running. Illy's voice cracked slightly, and because she doesn't deserve to pay for my mistakes. The silence stretched long and thin. Then Garrett nodded. All right, Mercer. You've got a deal. Tell me where it is. Illy took a breath, then spoke clearly. A day's ride north. There's a canyon with a lightning. Split pine at the entrance. The gold's buried at the base of the tree, all of it. Garrett's eyes gleamed. He turned to the men behind him. 2 of you ride out and check. If he's lying, we come back and burn this place to the ground. The men nodded and spurred their horses north. Garrett looked back at Illy. You better hope you're telling the truth, Mercer, for her sake. Then he mounted his horse and followed his men, leaving Illy and Clara standing alone in the dust. Clara turned on him, her face pale with fury and fear. What did you just do? What I had to. You gave them everything, I gave them gold, Illy said quietly. That's all it ever was. Metal, but you, his voice broke. You gave me something I didn't deserve, a chance, kindness, and I won't let them take that from you. Clara stared at him, her hands shaking, and for a moment she didn't know whether to hit him or pull him close. If they find it, if it's really there, they'll take you. I know. And if it's not. Illy met her eyes, and in them she saw the truth. Then we both burn. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky red and gold, and in the distance, dust rose like smoke against the dying light. The night passed like a held breath, long, suffocating, impossible to release. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago, staring at the lantern flame until her eyes burned. Across from her, Illy sat rigid and silent, his gaze fixed on the window where darkness pressed against the glass like something alive. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They'd made their choices, drawn their lines in the dust, and now all they could do was wait. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second falling like a hammer strike. Somewhere near midnight, Illy finally moved. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the window. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed, haunted, a ghost of the man who'd stumbled out of the storm weeks ago. You should sleep, Clara said quietly. Can't. Neither can I. He turned to look at her, his face half shadowed in the lamplight. I meant what I said. If they find the gold, if they take me, you'll be safe. That was the deal. And you think men like that keep their word? Illy's jaw tightened. I think they want the gold more than they want revenge. You're wrong. Clara set the cup down, her voice hard. Men like Garrett don't just want what you took. They want you broken. They want everyone to see what happens when someone crosses them. She stood, moving closer until she could see the fear he was trying to hide. That gold isn't just money to them. It's power, and they'll kill to keep it. Then I'll make sure they get it before they get to you. Illy, this isn't your fight, Clara. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, her fingers tight enough to leave marks. It became my fight the moment I opened that barn door, the moment I lied for you, the moment I chose you over them. Her voice cracked, raw with exhaustion and something deeper. So don't you dare tell me to walk away now. Illy stared at her, something fierce and desperate rising in his chest. For a heartbeat, he thought about pulling her closer, about saying all the things he'd kept buried beneath guilt and fear. But the words wouldn't come. They never did. Instead, he just nodded. All right, he whispered. All right. Clara released his wrist and stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and in the distance, so faint it might have been imagining, came the sound of hoofbeats. They both froze. The sound grew louder, closer, unmistakable. Now, riders moving fast. Illy's hand went to the knife at his belt. Clara grabbed the rifle from beside the door. They moved to the window together, peering out into the darkness, and saw them. Shapes emerging from the night, torches blazing like fallen stars. 4 riders, no, 5. More than had left. They found it, Illy said, his voice flat. Or they didn't. The riders pulled up short at the gate, their horses stamping and snorting, the torchlight casting wild shadows across the yard. Garrett sat at the front, his face grim and cold. Beside him, the scarred man from before held something in his hand, leather satchel, heavy and sagging. Mercer. Garrett's voice cut through the night like a blade. Get out here. Illy moved toward the door, but Clara blocked him with her body. Don't. I have to, not alone. They stepped out together, side by side, into the torchlight. The heat hit them first, then the smells. Smoke and sweat and horse and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or violence waiting to happen. Garrett's eyes fixed on Illy, cold and calculating. You told the truth, Mercer. Found the gold right where you said, every last coin. He gestured to the satchel. Company'll be pleased. Then we're done. Illy said evenly. You got what you came for. Now leave. Garrett's smile was slow and cruel. Not quite. The air shifted. We had a deal. Clara said, her voice sharp. The gold for his freedom. You got the gold. We got what he stole, yes, but that doesn't change what he did. Theft, desertion, inciting unrest among the workers. Garrett dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight. Man can't just take from the company and walk away. There has to be consequences. You mean punishment, Illy said quietly. I mean justice. You wouldn't know justice if it shot you. The scarred man moved his hand toward his gun, but Garrett raised a hand, stopping him. Careful, Mercer. You're in no position to talk back. Then what do you want? Clara demanded. You got your gold. What more could you possibly? An example. Garrett's voice went cold. That's what we need. Something to show the others back at the camp what happens when you cross Redemption Creek. He looked at Illy, and the torchlight gleamed in his eyes. You're coming with us, and you're going to stand trial in front of every man who ever thought about doing what you did. No. Clara stepped forward, the rifle rising. He gave you everything. The deal was I'd leave you alone. Garrett interrupted, and I will. You'll keep your land, your life. But him, he pointed at Illy. He comes with us. That was always how this was going to end. Illy's hand found Clara's shoulder, gentle but firm. It's all right. It's not, Clara. He turned her to face him, his eyes steady despite the fear beneath them. Let me go. No. You can't fight them all. And I won't let you die for me. Illy, please. The word broke something inside her. She wanted to scream, to fight, to pull the trigger and damn the consequences. But she saw the resignation in his face, the quiet acceptance of a man who'd known all along that running only delayed the inevitable. Touching, Garrett said flatly, But we're done here. Mercer, get on a horse now. Illy squeezed Clara's shoulder once, then let go. He walked toward the riders, his steps slow but steady, and Clara watched him go with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. He was halfway to the horses when the world exploded into fire. It happened fast, a torch arcing through the air, spinning end over end, landing on the barn roof with a crash of sparks. The dry wood caught instantly, flames spreading like water, devouring the shingles and crawling up toward the sky. No. Clara's scream tore from her throat. She ran toward the barn, but Illy was faster. He grabbed her around the waist and pulled her back, even as the heat slammed into them like a wall. The horses inside screamed, wild with panic, and Clara fought against Illy's grip, desperate to reach them. Let me go. The horses. It's too late. No. But he held her tight, dragging her backward as the flames roared higher, eating through the barn like a living thing. The roof collapsed inward with a groan of splitting wood and a shower of sparks that lit the night like daylight. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking, and Clara's eyes streamed as she watched everything Samuel had built, everything she'd fought to keep, burn to ash and ruin. Behind them, Garrett's voice rang out over the chaos. That's what happens when you harbor fugitives, Mrs. Gable. Consider yourself lucky. We're only taking the barn. Illy spun toward him, his face twisted with rage. You said you'd leave her alone. I said I wouldn't kill her. Didn't say anything about property. Garrett's smile was savage. Now get on the damn horse before I change my mind. For a moment, Illy looked ready to charge them, to throw himself at Garrett and the others with nothing but his bare hands and fury. But Clara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Don't, she gasped through the smoke. Don't give them a reason. Clara, go. Her voice broke. Just go, please. Illy stared at her, his chest heaving, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears or just the sting of smoke. Then he pulled her close, quick, desperate, and pressed his forehead to hers. I'm sorry, he whispered. God, I'm so sorry. Then he let go and walked to the horses. They bound his hands and hauled him up onto a saddle. Garrett took the reins, wrapping them around his own saddle horn, and turned his horse toward the road. The other riders fell in around him, their torches still burning, and together they rode out into the darkness. Clara stood alone in the firelight, her arms wrapped around herself, watching them disappear. Illy looked back once, just once, and their eyes met across the distance. Then the night swallowed him and he was gone. The barn burned through the night. Clara tried to save what she could. hauling buckets of water from the well and throwing them uselessly at the flames, but it was like trying to stop the ocean with her hands. The fire consumed everything: the hay, the tools, the stalls where the horses had sheltered. By the time dawn broke, pale and gray, all that remained was blackened skeleton of beams and a field of ash that glowed faintly in the morning light. She stood in the middle of it, covered in soot and sweat, her lungs raw from smoke, and felt the weight of it settle over her like a shroud. Everything was gone. The barn, the horses, Illy. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the ash, her hands pressed against the still, warm ground. She wanted to scream, to rage, to tear the sky apart with her grief. But all that came out was a sound low, broken, inhuman, that echoed across the empty valley. She didn't know how long she knelt there. Minutes, hours, time had lost all meaning. The sun climbed higher, indifferent and bright, and the world kept turning as if nothing had happened. Eventually, she heard footsteps. Clara looked up, her vision blurred, and saw a shape approaching through the smoke. For a wild, desperate moment, she thought it might be Illy, that he'd somehow escaped, come back, that this nightmare was over. But it was Martin Hayes. He stood at the edge of the ruin, his hat in his hands, his face carefully neutral. Clara, I heard what happened, saw the smoke from my place. She didn't answer, just stared at him with eyes that felt like stone. I'm sorry, he said, and he almost sounded like he meant it. This is terrible, just terrible. Get off my land, Clara said, her voice hollow. I just wanted to see if you needed. Get off my land. Martin hesitated, then put his hat back on. The offer still stands, Clara. If you want to sell, if this is too much, I'll give you a fair price. More than fair, considering. He trailed off as Clara stood, swaying slightly, her hands clenched into fists. I said, get off my land. Her voice was low, dangerous, trembling with barely contained fury. And if you ever come back here, if you ever speak to me again, I will shoot you where you stand. Do you understand me? Martin's face hardened. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was not pulling the trigger when I had the chance. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the ash. Then Martin turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff with wounded pride. Clara watched him go, then looked down at her hands. They were black with soot, blistered and raw. She could still feel Illy's forehead pressed against hers. Still hear his voice breaking with apology. I'm sorry. She closed her eyes and the tears finally came, hot and bitter, carving clean tracks through the ash on her face. The days that followed were slow and colorless, like moving through water. Clara wandered the ruins of the barn, pulling out anything that hadn't been completely destroyed. A bent horseshoe, a half-burned bridle, a charred piece of wood that might have been part of the door. She laid them out in the yard like relics, like pieces of a life that had been taken from her. No one from town came to help. No one even came to ask if she was all right. The smoke had been visible for miles, but the road to her farm stayed empty. She was alone again, just like she'd been before the storm, except this time it hurt more. At night, she sat on the porch and stared north, toward the mountains where they'd taken him. She imagined him bound and bruised, dragged in front of men who'd already decided his guilt. She imagined him standing tall anyway, refusing to break, the way he had when he'd stepped out of the cabin and surrendered himself. She imagined him thinking of her. On the 5th day, she found his coin. It was half buried in the ash near where the barn door had been, the gold tarnished and blackened but still whole. She picked it up carefully, brushing away the soot, and read the words etched along the edge. Redemption Creek Mining Company. Clara closed her fist around it and pressed it against her heart. I won't forget. She whispered to the empty air. I won't let them win. The wind answered with a sigh, soft and low, carrying the smell of ash and rain and something that might have been hope. Faint, fragile, barely there, but there. She looked toward the horizon where the sky was beginning to clear and made herself a promise. This wasn't over, not yet. Clara woke each morning to the smell of ash that wouldn't leave. no matter how many times the wind blew through the valley. The blackened bones of the barn stood stark against the sky, a monument to everything she'd lost, everything they'd taken. She worked the land alone now, her hands blistering and bleeding. As she hauled water, mended fences, cleared debris, the work was endless, brutal, and she welcomed it. Anything to keep her mind from circling back to that night, to the sound of hoofbeats fading into darkness, to Ellie's face in the firelight. "I'm sorry." She kept the coin in her pocket, her fingers finding it a dozen times a day, in the garden, at the well, lying awake in the dark. The metal had worn smooth from handling, the etched letters barely visible now, but she didn't need to read them. She knew what they said, knew what they meant. Town had all but turned its back on her. When she went for supplies, conversation stopped. Eyes slid away. The clerk at the general store took her money without a word, his face carefully blank, and she understood what the silence meant. She'd chosen wrong, stood with the wrong man, and now she'd pay the price for as long as memory lasted. Martin Hayes had made an offer on her land twice more, each time lowering the price. Just being realistic, he'd said, standing at her gate with that practiced sympathy that made her want to spit. Land's harder to work without a barn. Without help, people understand if you want to move on. She'd told him the same thing each time, "Get off my property." He'd stopped coming after the second time, but she'd see him sometimes, riding the fence line between their lands, watching her struggle with the kind of patience that came from knowing time was on his side. Let him watch. She wasn't going anywhere, but late at night, when exhaustion finally pulled her under, she dreamed of fire, of Ellie's hands bound, of gold coins falling through her fingers like water, and no matter how hard she tried to hold on, they slipped away, leaving only ash. On the 22nd day, she woke to the sound of thunder. Clara sat up in bed, her heart racing, listening, but the sky outside was clear, pale blue and cloudless, the sun just beginning to crest the eastern ridge. She pushed the blanket aside and moved to the window, frowning. The sound came again, not thunder, something else, hoofbeats and wheels. She grabbed the rifle and ran outside, barefoot, her nightdress catching on the porch rail. The sound was coming from the south road, growing louder, a heavy rumble that made the ground tremble beneath her feet. Dust rose on the horizon, thick and golden in the early light. Clara raised the rifle, her finger on the trigger, her breath shallow, then the dust cleared and she saw it. A wagon, large, sturdy, pulled by 4 horses that moved with the steady, patient rhythm of animals that had been traveling a long time. And driving it, sitting on the bench with the reins loose in his hands, was a figure she'd thought she'd never see again. Illy. The rifle slipped from her hands and clattered against the porch boards. He was thinner than she remembered, his face shadowed with exhaustion and something harder. But his eyes, when they found hers across the distance, were alive, clear, free. The wagon rolled to a stop at her gate. Illy climbed down slowly, wincing as his boots hit the ground, and stood there for a moment as if unsure whether to come closer. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his hands wrapped in bandages, and there was a fresh scar along his jawline that hadn't been there before. But he was here. He was alive. Clara walked toward him like someone moving through a dream, her feet bare in the dust, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the rise and fall of his chest, the faint tremor in his hands. "You're here," she whispered. "I'm here. How?" "It's a long story." Illy glanced back at the wagon, then at her, and something soft crossed his face. "Can I tell you inside?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice, and led him toward the cabin. She was acutely aware of her bare feet, her loose hair, the nightdress that hung too thin in the morning light. But none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the fact that he was here, walking beside her, solid and real. Inside, she put water on to boil while Illy sat at the table, his hands resting flat on the wood as if grounding himself. She poured 2 cups of coffee when it was ready, strong, bitter, the way they'd shared it before, and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just looked at each other, taking inventory of the damage time and violence had carved into skin and bone. "They took you north," Clara said finally, "to Redemption Creek." "They did. And Illy picked up his cup but didn't drink, just held it, letting the warmth seep into his palms. They put me in front of the workers, bound me to a post in the center of camp, and told everyone what I'd done. That I'd stolen from the company, betrayed them, lied. He paused, his jaw tightening. They were going to make an example of me. Garrett wanted to beat me in front of everyone, then hang me at dawn. Clara's breath caught. But you're here. Because the workers wouldn't let them. She blinked. What? Turned out I wasn't the only one who'd been keeping records, asking questions. Illy looked up, his eyes distant, remembering. There was a man, older, been working there since the mine opened. He stood up while Garrett was speaking. Said he'd seen the ledgers too, before I took them. Said he knew the company was stealing wages, cutting corners, letting men die because it was cheaper than making the tunnels safe. His voice grew stronger. Then another man stood. Then another. Within minutes, half the camp was on their feet, demanding to see proof of what I'd stolen. Demanding a real trial, not a lynching. And Garrett tried to shut them down, threatened them. But there were too many, and they were angry, angrier than I'd realized. Illy set the cup down, his hands shaking slightly. So they held a trial, a real one. Let me speak. Let the workers see the ledgers. And when it was done, they didn't just let me go. They turned on the company. Clara leaned forward, her heart pounding. What happened? The workers seized the mine, locked Garrett and his men in the company office, and refused to let them out until they agreed to negotiate. Fair wages, safe conditions, compensation for the families of the men who died. Illy's eyes gleamed. It took 3 days, but the company broke, agreed to everything, and they let me go as part of the deal. Proof that they were serious about making things right. My God, Clara breathed. That's not all. Illy stood and walked to the door, gesturing toward the wagon outside. Before I left, the workers took up a collection, said the gold I'd taken. The gold Garrett recovered. It had belonged to them in the first place. Their wages stolen and hoarded, so they took it back, all of it. He looked at her, his voice quiet but steady, and they told me to return it to the families who'd lost someone, to make sure it went where it was supposed to go. Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady. The wagon is full of gold. Every coin accounted for, every name written down. Illy's throat worked as he swallowed. I've been traveling for 2 weeks, stopping at every town, every farm where a widow or a child was left behind, giving them what they were owed, what the company tried to bury. She walked past him and out into the yard, moving toward the wagon like someone drawn by gravity. The back was covered with canvas, tied down tight. Illy followed and pulled the canvas aside. Gold gleamed in the sunlight. Coins, bars, bags heavy with weight. More wealth than Clara had ever seen in one place, stacked carefully. Organized with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who'd counted every piece, memorized every name. There's still more to deliver, Illy said quietly. Families up north, out west. It'll take months to reach them all, but I wanted. He stopped, his voice catching. I needed to come here first, to see if you were all right, to see if you'd. He couldn't finish. Clara turned to face him, her eyes bright. If I'd what? If you'd forgiven me. The words came out raw, barely more than a whisper, for bringing this down on you, for the barn, for leaving you alone. She stepped closer, close enough to see the guilt etched into every line of his face, and reached out to touch the scar on his jaw. Her fingers were gentle, careful, tracing the raised skin. There's nothing to forgive, she said softly. Clara, you did what you had to do. And so did I. Her hand dropped to his chest, resting over his heart. You didn't bring trouble to my door, Illy. You brought a choice, and I made it. I'd make it again. Illy's hand came up to cover hers, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. I thought about you every day. Wondered if you were safe, if they'd come back. If I'm still here, Clara said, I'm still standing. I can see that. His voice broke slightly. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. So are you. They stood there in the morning light, the wagon gleaming behind them, the valley stretching wide and gold around them. The world felt impossibly vast and impossibly small all at once, like the only thing that mattered was this moment, this breath, this fragile connection between two people who survived the fire. What happens now? Clara asked quietly. Illy looked down at their joined hands. I finish what I started. Deliver the gold. Make sure every family gets what they're owed. He paused, but after that, he met her eyes, and in them she saw hope warring with fear, longing fighting against the belief that he didn't deserve what he wanted most. I'd like to come back, he said, if you'll have me. Help you rebuild the barn, work the land, stay. His grip tightened on her hand, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belongs. Clara's breath caught, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of the long, lonely nights, the empty table, the barn that was nothing but ash and memory. She thought of all the reasons she should say no. The talk in town, the judgment, the danger that might still be lurking somewhere beyond the horizon. And then she thought of the way he'd stood between her and the riders. The way he'd worked himself to exhaustion, just to prove he was worth the mercy she'd shown. The way he looked at her now, as if she was something precious and breakable, and infinitely strong all at once. Yes, she said. Illy blinked. Yes, you can come back. Yes, you can stay. Her voice steadied, grew stronger. Yes, you belong here. Something broke open in his face, relief and joy and disbelief all tangled together. He pulled her closer, his forehead dropping to rest against hers the way it had the night they'd taken him, and for a moment they just stood there, breathing together, holding on. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me yet. There's a lot of work to do. He laughed, quiet, hoarse, but genuine. I'm good at work. I know. They pulled apart slowly, reluctantly, and turned to look at the wagon. The gold gleamed in the sunlight, heavy with meaning, with the weight of lives lost and debts finally paid. How long will it take? Clara asked, to deliver all of it. 2 months, maybe 3. Illy glanced at her. Will you be all right until then? I've been all right this long. I know, but, Illy. She turned to face him fully, her expression serious. I'll be here when you get back. I promise. He nodded, something fierce and grateful flickering in his eyes. Then I'll make it as fast as I can. He left the next morning, the wagon loaded and ready, his horse tied behind. Clara stood on the porch and watched him go, the coin still in her pocket, her hand curled around it like a talisman. Illy looked back 3 times before the road curved and took him out of sight. Each time, she raised her hand in farewell. Each time he did the same. Then he was gone and she was alone again. But this time it felt different. This time the loneliness had an end, a shape, a promise. Clara walked back into the cabin and stood in the center of the kitchen, looking around at the worn furniture, faded curtains, the empty chair across from hers. Then she walked to the drawer where she kept paper and ink, pulled out a sheet, and began to write. A list, materials for rebuilding the barn, seeds for planting, supplies they'd need for winter. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the sun climbed high and bright, until the future stopped being something that happened to her and became something she was building, piece by careful piece. Outside, the wind moved through the valley, soft and warm, carrying the scent of wildflowers and rain. The ash had begun to settle, mixing with soil, becoming part of the earth again. And in the distance, barely visible against the horizon, a thin line of dust rose where a wagon traveled north, carrying gold and hope and the promise of return. Clara set down the pen and walked to the window, watching the dust fade into the sky. Come back. Safe, she whispered, and somewhere beyond the mountains, as if he'd heard her, Illy Mercer urged the horses faster and thought of home. The days stretched long and golden, the heat pressing down on the valley with the kind of weight that made everything move slower. The wind through the grass, clouds drifting overhead, even time itself seemed to soften at the edges. Clara worked through it all, her skin turning brown under the sun, her hands growing calloused and strong. She cleared the ruins of the barn piece by piece, hauling away the charred beams and blackened nails, sorting what could be salvaged from what needed to be buried. It was hard work, solitary work, but she didn't mind. Each board removed, each stone cleared, felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from her. Not just the barn, but the belief that good things could survive fire. At night, she sat on the porch and watched the stars wheel overhead, the coin warm in her pocket, and thought of Illy somewhere out there beneath the same sky. She wondered which town he was in, which widow's door he was knocking on, which child's face lit up when he handed over the gold their father had died earning. She imagined him tired but steady, driven by the same quiet determination that had kept him working through those early weeks when his hands were still healing and every swing of the hammer hurt. 2 months, he'd said, maybe 3, she'd wait. The town slowly began to change its mind about her. She didn't notice at first. It started small, Mrs. Lawson nodding to her after church instead of turning away. The clerk at the general store asking how she was managing, his voice careful but genuine. A farmer she barely knew leaving a basket of vegetables at her gate with a note that said simply, "Thought you could use these." Clara didn't understand it until the 4th week, when she overheard 2 women talking outside the post office. Heard that man she was hiding, the one they said was a thief. He wasn't stealing at all. He was trying to help people. That's what my husband said. His cousin works at Redemption Creek. Said the whole camp rose up after they took that man away. Forced the company to pay what they owed. And she knew, that widow. She knew he was trying to do right. And she protected him anyway. Took courage that. Standing up to those men. Clara had stood frozen in the shadow of the building, her heart pounding as the women walked away. Courage. They'd called it courage, not foolishness, not betrayal, courage. She'd gone home and cried for the first time since the barn burned. Not from grief, but from relief so profound it felt like breaking open. The letter came on a Tuesday. Clara was in the garden, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up to see the male rider, a young man named Daniel who made the circuit between towns, dismounting at her gate. "Afternoon, Mrs. Gable," he called, holding up an envelope. "Got something for you." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, frowning. She never got letters. There was no one left to write to her. "Who's it from?" she asked. "Postmark says Silverton, up north." Daniel handed it over with a smile. "Looks important." Clara turned the envelope over in her hands. Her name was written across the front in careful, slightly awkward handwriting, as if the writer wasn't used to holding a pen. There was no return address. "Thank you," she said absently. Daniel tipped his hat and rode off, leaving her standing in yard with the envelope pressed against her chest. She knew who it was from before she even opened it. Knew it the way you know the shape of a storm before it arrives. Inside, she sat at the table and broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was short, written on a single sheet of rough paper that looked like it had been folded and refolded a dozen times. "Clara, I'm writing from Silverton, about halfway through the list. The family's here. They cried when I gave them the gold. Not because of the money, though that helps, but because someone remembered. Someone cared enough to make it right. I think of you every day. Of your land, your courage, the way you stood your ground when anyone else would have run. You gave me more than shelter, Clara. You gave me a reason to believe people could still be good. I'll be home soon. 2 more weeks, maybe less. There's a family in Cedar Wood I need to reach, and then 1 more stop in Pine Falls. After that, the list is done. I'm bringing timber, good, strong pine from the mill in Silverton, enough to rebuild the barn twice over. I know you've probably already started without me. I wouldn't expect anything less, but I want to help finish it. Want to be part of making it whole again. Wait for me." Clara read the letter 3 times, her eyes blurring with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket with the coin, where it rested against her heart like a promise. More weeks. She could wait 2 more weeks. On the day he was supposed to return, Clara woke before dawn. She dressed carefully, not in her work clothes, but in the blue dress she'd worn to church before Samuel died, the one she'd kept wrapped in paper at the bottom of her trunk. It still fit, though. It hung a little looser now, her body leaner from months of hard labor. She braided her hair and pinned it up, her hands shaking slightly, then stood in front of the small mirror by the wash basin and barely recognized herself. She looked hopeful. Outside, the world was still gray and cool. Sun just a promise on the horizon. Clara made coffee and sat on the porch, her hands wrapped around the cup, her eyes fixed on the south road where the dust would first appear. An hour passed, then two. The sun climbed higher, turning the valley gold, and still the road stayed empty. Clara told herself not to worry, told herself he might be delayed, a wagon wheel broken, a family that needed more time, 1,000 small things that could slow a journey. But her chest tightened with every passing minute, her mind conjuring darker possibilities, another storm, more riders, an accident on road. Wait for me, he'd written, so she waited. Noon came and went. The heat pressed down thick and heavy. Clara moved inside to escape the sun, pacing the kitchen, glancing out the window every few minutes. The coffee went cold. She made more, didn't drink it. By mid-afternoon, she'd convinced herself something had gone wrong. She was reaching for the rifle, planning to ride out and search the road herself, when she heard it. The distant rumble of wheels, the steady rhythm of hooves. Clara ran outside, her heart hammering, and saw the dust rising in the south. Thick and golden, moving fast. The wagon came into view moments later, larger than before, piled high with timber that gleamed pale and fresh in the sunlight. And driving it, his face shaded by the brim of his hat, was Illy. He saw her standing on the porch and pulled the horses to a stop so fast they tossed their heads in protest. Then he was climbing down, moving toward her with long, urgent strides, and Clara was running, actually running across the yard to meet him. They collided in the middle, his arms wrapping around her and lifting her off the ground, her hands fisting in his shirt as if letting go would make him disappear. She could feel his heart pounding against hers, could smell the dust and sweat and pine on him, could hear him saying her name over and over like a prayer. "You're here," she gasped. "You're really here?" "I'm here. I'm not leaving again." She pulled back just enough to see his face, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not just relief or joy, but something deeper, something raw and unguarded that looked like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. "I missed you," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Every day I missed you. I missed you too." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Thought about you every mile, every family I met, every coin I handed over. I kept thinking about getting back here. To you. You're home now. Am I?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. "Is that what this is?" Clara smiled, and it felt like the first real smile she'd worn in months. "Yes, this is home, and you belong here." Illy's eyes closed for a moment, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I don't deserve you. Good thing, I don't care what you deserve." He laughed, soft, broken, beautiful, and kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then hesitantly, as if asking permission, her mouth. Clara kissed him back, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, anchoring herself to him. It was gentle and fierce all at once, tasting of dust and coffee and hope, and when they finally pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, the world felt brighter than it had in years. "Help me unload the timber," Illy asked, his voice rough. "In a minute." Clara took his hand and led him to the porch, making him sit while she brought water and bread. "You look half dead. When's the last time you ate?" "This morning. Maybe yesterday morning. I wasn't stopping until I got here." "Stubborn fool," says the woman who cleared a burned barn by herself. Clara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they ate in comfortable silence. The timber sat gleaming in the wagon bed, the horses dozed in the sun, and the valley stretched wide and peaceful around them. "It's really done?" Clara asked after a while. "All the families, they all got what they were owed, every last one." Illy set down his cup and pulled a worn notebook from his pocket, the pages filled with names and numbers, each one carefully crossed out. 60, 3 families. Some got a few coins, some got enough to start over completely, but they all got something, and they all know it came from the workers, from their husbands and fathers and brothers fighting for what was right. Clara took the notebook and ran her fingers over the names, each one a story, a life, a piece of justice finally served. "You did a good thing, Illy. We did a good thing. You're the one who made it possible. I just opened a door. You did more than that." He turned to face her fully. "You showed me that mercy matters, that one person standing up can change everything. I wouldn't have fought for that gold if you hadn't fought for me first." Clara looked at him, at the man who'd stumbled out of a storm and into her life, who'd brought chaos and fire and ultimately hope, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Something that felt like peace. "So what now?" she asked. Illy glanced at the timber, then at the cleared space where the barn had stood. "Now we build." They started the next morning. Illy laid out the dimensions while Clara hauled stone for the foundation. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy rhythm, him measuring and cutting, her holding beams steady while he hammered. The work was slow, meticulous, but there was joy in it. Every nail driven home, every post raised, felt like an act of defiance against everything that had tried to break them. Word spread quickly. On the third day, the farmer who'd left vegetables at Clara's gate showed up with his 2 sons and a wagon full of tools. "Heard you're rebuilding," he said simply. "Thought you could use help." By the end of the week, a dozen people had come. Men and women from town and neighboring farms, bringing food and supplies and labor. They worked through the heat of the day, laughing and talking, and when evening came, they gathered in Clara's yard to eat and rest before heading home. Mrs. Lawson brought a pot of stew and an apology. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her eyes downcast, "for the way I treated you. It wasn't right." Clara took the pot and smiled. "Thank you for this and for coming. That man of yours, he's a good one. He is. You're lucky." Clara glanced over at Illy, who was showing one of the younger boys how to drive a nail straight, his patience endless. "I know." The barn rose slowly but surely, walls and beams and a roof that gleamed bright against the sky. It was larger than the old one, stronger, built with hands that cared about more than just wood and nails. It was built with intention, with love. On the day they raised the final beam, the entire town showed up. They gathered in the yard, cheering as Illy climbed the ladder and drove the last nail home, then descended to where Clara stood waiting. He pulled her into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children, and the crowd erupted in applause. That night, they held a celebration, tables laden with food, lanterns strung between the trees, music from an old fiddle that someone had brought. Clara stood in the center of it all, watching her neighbors dance and eat and talk, and felt something she hadn't felt since Samuel died. She felt like she belonged. Illy found her standing alone near the new barn, her hand resting against the wood, and slipped his fingers between hers. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it's beautiful. That I can't believe we did this. You've been doing impossible things since the day I met you." Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad you stayed. Couldn't have left if I wanted to. You're stuck with me now." "Good." They stood together in the lantern light. The valley spread out around them like a promise, and watched the stars come out one by one. Autumn came gently, painting the trees gold and red, the air turning crisp and cool. Clara and Illy worked the land together, harvesting the garden, preparing for winter. The barn filled with hay and tools, and 2 new horses Illy had bought from a farm in the next county. The cabin felt warmer now, fuller, with 2 pairs of boots by the door and 2 cups on the table. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Illy reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin, the one Clara had carried for months, the one she'd returned to him the day he came back. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what to do with this." "Keep it," Clara said. "It's yours." "It's not, though. It's a reminder of what was wrong of a company that valued gold more than lives." He turned it over in his hands, the metal catching the last light. "I want to bury it, here, on this land. Not as a memorial to what was lost, but as a marker for what we built instead." Clara was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Where?" "By the barn, where the old one stood." They walked together across the yard, the grass soft beneath their feet, and Illy knelt at the base of the new barn's foundation. He dug a small hole with his hands, placed the coin inside, and covered it with earth. Clara knelt beside him and pressed her palm against the ground, feeling the warmth still lingering from the sun. "It's done," Illy said softly. "No." Clara looked at him, her eyes bright. "It's just beginning." He smiled and pulled her close, and they sat together in the fading light. The valley stretched wide and gold around them, the future opening like a door they'd built with their own hands. Winter came and went, spring returned, and with it came wildflowers, tiny bursts of yellow and white that covered the fields like stars fallen to earth. Children from town came to play in Clara's yard, chasing each other through the grass while their parents sat on the porch and talked. The barn stood tall and proud, its wood weathered now but still strong. Illy planted a garden larger than the year before, his hands steady and sure. Clara baked bread and shared it with neighbors who no longer saw her as a widow alone, but as a woman who'd found her place in the world. On quiet mornings, when the mist still clung to the valley and the world felt new, they would stand together at the edge of their land and watch the sun rise, painting the sky gold and rose and every color hope had ever worn. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one such morning. Everything that happened. Illy was quiet for a long moment, his hand finding hers. "No. It cost me everything I thought I had, but it gave me everything I needed." "And what's that?" He turned to face her, his eyes soft and certain. "A home, a purpose, you." Clara smiled and kissed him, soft and slow, and when they pulled apart, the world felt impossibly wide and impossibly full all at once. They walked back to the cabin together, their footsteps leaving tracks in the dew, wet grass, and behind them the valley woke. Birds singing, wind moving through the trees, the earth turning steadily beneath it all. The storm that had brought them together was long gone, its fury spent and forgotten. But what it left behind remained, written in the lines of a rebuilt barn, in the wildflowers that bloomed where ash had fallen, in the quiet strength of two people who'd chosen mercy over fear and found that love could grow even in the hardest soil. And when travelers passed through the valley in years to come, they would hear the story of the widow who sheltered a stranger, of the man who returned justice to the forgotten, of the night a barn burned, and the morning hope was rebuilt from its ashes. They would hear it and remember that kindness, once given, never truly dies. It spreads like seeds on the wind, taking root in unexpected places, blooming when the world needs it most. And in a small cabin at the edge of the valley, two people lived that truth every day, not as something grand or heroic, but as something simple and enduring. They lived it in morning coffee shared at a worn table, in hands clasped during evening walks, in the barn that stood witness to their resilience, in the laughter of children playing in their yard, in quiet certainty that some storms, no matter how fierce, lead not to endings but to beginnings. The land remembered, the valley remembered, and the story continued, written not in words but in the lives they built together, from ash and gold, and the stubborn, beautiful belief that mercy always mattered most. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth, and in the garden, new seeds began to stir beneath the soil, reaching toward the light.